Sometimes life humbles us in ways we never see coming. What happens when a faded rock star's cruel joke becomes the moment that changes everything? Danny Voss was once a legend, but now he's desperate for attention. He spots a homeless man with a guitar and decides to mock him on camera. The homeless man starts playing, and what comes out stops everyone cold. His music is beautiful, heartbreaking, and real. The crowd grows silent, then amazed. Danny realizes he's made a terrible mistake. These two broken men are about to discover something neither expected. But who is this mysterious guitarist, and what tragedy put him on the streets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The tarnished Grammy Award sat on Danny Voss's kitchen counter like a relic from another man's life. Dust had settled in the grooves of the golden gramophone, and the nameplate read, Daniel Voss. Best Rock Performance, 1987. 38 years. Old, that award. Danny picked it up, feeling its weight still substantial, still real. Unlike most everything else in his world these days, his Malibu mansion echoed with emptiness. The walls still displayed platinum records and magazine covers from his glory days, but they felt more like evidence of a crime than celebration of achievement. Danny Voss, the guitar god who ruled the 80s, read one faded Rolling Stone cover. The man in the photo looked confident, almost arrogant, with wild hair and leather pants that cost more than most people's cars. That man seemed like a stranger. Now, the phone buzzed against the marble countertop. Marcus Chen, his manager for the past 3 years, had been calling all morning. Danny knew what Marcus wanted, the same thing he'd been pushing for months. The comeback series. The viral content. The desperate grab for relevance in a world that had moved on without him. Danny, thank God. Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker when Danny finally answered. We need to talk about tomorrow's shoot. The street musician angle is perfect. Raw, authentic, real people making real music. The algorithm loves that authenticity stuff. Danny walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific. The ocean stretched endlessly, indifferent to his problems. Marcus, I've been thinking. Don't think, Danny. Feel. This is about reconnecting with your roots, remember? When you started playing on street corners in Hollywood, before the fame, before the money. Pure music, pure passion. But Danny remembered those street corners differently. He remembered the hunger, the desperation, the way people walked past, without really seeing him. He remembered the relief when he finally escaped that life, swearing he'd never go back. Now here he was, being asked to return as a tourist in his own past. The production crew is set up downtown, Marcus continued. All you have to do is walk around, interact with some street performers, maybe jam a little. Show people the human side of Danny Voss. The viewers eat that stuff up. Through the glass, Danny caught his reflection 55 years old, still lean but softer around the edges, silver threading through hair that once bounced with every headbang. His ex-wife Sarah used to say he looked distinguished now. But Sarah had been gone for 3 years, and his daughter Emma barely returned his calls anymore. The rent on this place is killing me, Marcus. The words came out quietly, an admission he'd been avoiding. The royalty checks keep getting smaller. My accountant says if something doesn't change soon, which is exactly why we're doing this series. Danny Voss, Back to the Streets, is going to be huge. I can feel it. We already have interest from 3 streaming platforms, and the first episode isn't even shot yet. Danny set the Grammy back down, noting how it clinked against the counter, not the solid thud it should have made. Even the award felt hollow now. What if people don't care anymore? What if they just see some old rocker trying too hard? Danny, listen to me. You were on stage with Springsteen. You opened for the Rolling Stones. Twice. Your guitar solos are still being covered on YouTube by kids who weren't even born when you recorded them. The talent doesn't just disappear. But talent wasn't the problem. Danny knew. The problem was everything else, the industry that chewed up artists and spat them out, the fans who moved on to the next big thing, the way success could insulate you from reality until you woke up one day and realized you'd been living in a bubble that was slowly deflating. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Saw the trailer for your show. Please tell me you're not going to embarrass yourself. Even his own daughter doubted him. The same daughter who used to sit on his lap while he played acoustic guitar, who begged him to sing her to sleep with lullabies he'd written just for her. I need this to work, Marcus, Danny said finally. I can't lose this house. It's all I have left. It's going to work. Trust me. Street music is authentic. It's grassroots. People are tired of overproduced pop. They want something real, something with soul. And who better to find it than Danny Voss? After hanging up, Danny walked through his empty house. 23 rooms, most of them unused. The recording studio in the basement hadn't been touched in months. His collection of vintage guitars hung on the walls like museum pieces, beautiful, valuable, and silent. He'd bought this place at the height of his fame, imagining it filled with friends, family, music, and laughter. Instead, it had become a mausoleum of his former life. In his bedroom, framed photos told the story of his decline. There was Sarah on their wedding day, radiant in white, believing in their future together. There was Emma as a little girl, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a toy guitar. There were pictures from award shows, backstage at concerts, magazine shoots, all from a time when Danny Voss meant something to the world. The most recent photo was from last Christmas, just Emma and him at an awkward dinner in a restaurant neither of them had wanted to go to. She'd been polite but distant, checking her phone, counting the minutes until she could leave. The conversation had been stilted, full of careful topics that avoided anything real. I miss your music, Dad, she'd said at one point, and Danny had felt a flutter of hope. Then she'd added, the old stuff, I mean, before you started trying so hard. That night, Danny stood in his shower, letting hot water run over him as he wondered when exactly he'd started trying so hard. When had music stopped being about expression and started being about survival? When had he stopped playing because he loved it and started playing because he needed people to love him for it? Tomorrow, he would walk downtown with cameras following him, looking for authentic street musicians to feature on his comeback show. He would smile and nod and pretend this was all his idea. Pretend he wasn't terrified that people would see right through him. He would try to recapture something. He wasn't sure he'd ever really had that connection to music that made it feel like breathing, like truth, like home. But tonight, in his empty mansion overlooking an indifferent ocean, Danny Voss was just a man holding a tarnished trophy, wondering if he'd ever been as good as people said he was, or if he'd simply been lucky enough to be in the right place when the world was ready to believe in guitar gods. The Grammy caught the light from his bedside lamp, throwing a reflection across the ceiling, a dancing golden spot that flickered and swayed, beautiful and impossible to hold. The morning air downtown carried the scent of coffee, exhaust, and something Danny couldn't quite identify, maybe hope, maybe desperation. The production crew had set up discreetly, with handheld cameras and wireless microphones that made Danny feel like he was performing surgery on his own reputation. Remember, we want this to feel natural. The director, a 20-something named Kyle with perfectly distressed jeans, explained for the third time. Just walk around, see what catches your eye. If you find someone interesting, engage with them. Let the music guide you. Danny nodded, though nothing about this felt natural. The small crowd of onlookers held their phones up, already recording before anything had happened. Social media had turned everyone into a documentary filmmaker, and Danny was about to become their subject. The street corner bustled with typical downtown energy office workers rushing to meetings, tourists consulting maps, vendors setting up their carts. And there, leaning against a weathered brick wall, sat a man who looked like he'd been forgotten by time itself. He was probably mid-50s, though the streets had a way of aging people in dog years. His clothes were layered and worn, not dirty, but lived in, like they carried stories in every thread. His hair, streaked with gray, hung past his shoulders, and his beard was neat despite his circumstances. But what caught Danny's attention was the guitar case beside him, beaten and scarred, held together with duct tape and hope. The man wasn't playing. He wasn't even asking for money. He just sat there, occasionally looking up at the sky like he was reading something written in the clouds. His hands rested on his knees, and Danny could see calluses on his fingertips, the kind that came from years of pressing steel strings against fretboards. "That's perfect," Kyle whispered, gesturing for the camera operator to get closer. "A real street musician. This is exactly what we need." Danny felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten before walking on stage for the first time, or before his first recording session, or before meeting Sarah's parents. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something that could change everything. He approached the man slowly, aware of the cameras tracking his movement, aware of the growing crowd of phone-wielding spectators. The man looked up as Danny's shadow fell across him, and Danny was surprised by his eyes, clear, intelligent, and utterly without the desperation Danny had expected to find. "Afternoon," Danny said, and immediately felt foolish. The word sounded artificial, like he was reading from a script. "Afternoon," the man replied. His voice was weathered but warm, with an accent Danny couldn't place. Southern, maybe, or Midwestern somewhere. With porches and fireflies in front yards where children played until dark. "I'm Danny," he said, extending his hand. "Danny Voss." The man's expression didn't change at the recognition of the name. He simply shook Danny's hand with a firm grip and said, "Lucas, that your guitar?" Danny asked, nodding toward the case. "For now," Lucas replied, which struck Danny as an odd answer. Who owned a guitar, for now? The cameras circled them like mechanical vultures, and Danny could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. This was supposed to be the moment, the authentic interaction that would prove Danny. Voss still had connection to real music, real people, real life. "You play much?" Danny asked, and immediately regretted the question. Of course he played. You didn't carry a guitar case around downtown if you didn't play. Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying Danny with those clear eyes. "Some," he said. Silence stretched between them, and Danny felt the pressure mounting. The cameras were rolling, the crowd was watching, and this was supposed to be content. This was supposed to be the moment that launched his comeback. "Maybe you could play something?" Danny suggested, and then, because it felt like it needed justification, added, "For the camera. I'm doing this thing about street music, about real musicians." Lucas looked at the cameras for the first time, then back at Danny. Something shifted in his expression, not hostility, exactly, but a kind of wariness, like he was seeing Danny clearly for the first time. "Real musicians," Lucas repeated slowly. "Yeah, you know," Danny continued, feeling himself dig deeper into something he didn't understand. "People who play for the love of it, not for fame or money. Pure music." The words felt like ash in his mouth even as he said them. Behind Lucas, Danny could see Kyle making encouraging gestures, urging him to push harder, to create the moment they needed. "Tell you what," Danny said, and his voice took on a tone he didn't recognize, condescending, privileged, cruel. "If you can play something decent, something that actually sounds like music, I'll make sure you get some exposure. Maybe even some money." The crowd around them had grown larger, phones held high, everyone eager to capture whatever was about to happen. Danny could hear someone say his name, could feel the energy building like electricity before a storm. Lucas looked at Danny for a long moment, then at the cameras, then at the crowd. He reached for his guitar case with deliberate slowness, his calloused fingers working the latches. The case opened with a soft click, revealing an instrument that had clearly seen better decades. The guitar was a Martin D28, probably from the 70s, Danny guessed. It was scarred and worn. The finish faded and cracked, but as Lucas lifted it from the case, Danny could see it had been cared for. The strings were new, the tuning pegs moved smoothly, and when Lucas cradled it against his body, it looked like it belonged there. Lucas began to tune the guitar, plucking each string and adjusting the tension with practiced ease. The crowd grew quiet, expectant. Danny found himself holding his breath, suddenly unsure of what he'd set in motion. And then Lucas began to play. The first notes came soft and low, like a conversation between old friends. Lucas's fingers moved across the fretboard with fluid precision, finding melodies that seemed to emerge from some deep, hidden place. It wasn't flashy or technical, it was something else entirely. It was honest. The music built slowly, layer upon layer, as Lucas's weathered hands coaxed sounds from the old Martin that Danny hadn't heard in years. It was the sound of late nights and early mornings, of rain on windows and coffee growing cold, of letters never sent and words never spoken. It was the sound of a man who had lived through something and come out the other side changed. The crowd around them had gone completely silent. Even the traffic seemed to quiet, as if the entire city was leaning in to listen. Danny felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. This wasn't just good. This was extraordinary. Lucas closed his eyes as he played, lost in the music, and Danny realized with horrible clarity that he was witnessing something he'd spent his entire career trying to achieve: pure, unfiltered musical expression, untainted by ego or ambition or the desperate need to be seen. The song, if it was a song, if it wasn't just Lucas's soul speaking directly through 6 strings, came to a gentle end, the final notes hanging in the air like incense. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was complete, reverent, like the pause after a prayer. Then the applause began, scattered at first, then building into something approaching thunder. People were wiping their eyes, reaching for their wallets, calling out compliments and requests for more. The cameras captured it all: the music, the crowd's reaction, and Danny's face, which showed a mixture of awe, recognition, and something that looked disturbingly like shame. Lucas opened his eyes and looked directly at Danny, and in that look was a question that cut deeper than any lyric. "Was that decent enough for you?" Danny felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. He had come here to find authentic street music, to showcase real musicians for his comeback show. Instead, he had humiliated himself in front of a man who could play circles around most of the professionals Danny knew. He had revealed himself to be exactly what he'd been afraid he was, has been: desperate for relevance, willing to mock others to make himself feel important. The cameras kept rolling, capturing his realization in high definition. Somewhere in the crowd, phones were already uploading the video to social media, where it would spread like wildfire, where his casual cruelty and Lucas's transcendent response would be dissected by millions of strangers. Danny opened his mouth to say something, an apology, an explanation, anything, but Lucas had already begun packing his guitar away. He moved with the same deliberate care he'd shown while playing, wrapping the instrument in a soft cloth before placing it gently in the case. "Wait," Danny said, but Lucas was already standing, slinging the case over his shoulder with practiced ease. "Thank you," Lucas said quietly, and Danny wasn't sure if he was thanking him for the opportunity to play, or for the lesson in humility, or for something else entirely. Then Lucas walked away, disappearing into the crowd like water into sand, leaving Danny standing alone with his cameras and his crew and the growing realization that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career, not because it would ruin him, but because it had shown him exactly who he had become. The video went viral within hours. Danny sat in his home studio, watching the view count climb past 50,000, then 100,000, then 500,000. The comments section was a battlefield of outrage and admiration, but not in the way Danny had hoped. That homeless guy just destroyed Danny Voss without saying a word. Imagine being so washed up you have to pick on street musicians for content. Who is this guitarist? He's incredible. Danny Voss used to be cool. This is just sad. Marcus called every 20 minutes with updates that felt like death by 1,000 cuts. The video was trending on Twitter. TikTok had picked it up, and entertainment blogs were already writing think pieces about the fall of Danny Voss and when privilege meets real talent. But it was Emma's text that cut deepest. Dad, what were you thinking? This is humiliating. Danny clicked through to a YouTube video someone had posted called Street Musician School's Famous Guitarist. It had already gathered 2 million views. The comments there were even more brutal, but they weren't focused on him anymore. They were asking questions about Lucas. Does anyone know who this guy is? That playing is professional level. How is he homeless? This man has a story. Someone needs to find him. Danny found himself watching the video again and again, studying Lucas's face, his technique, the way he held the guitar like it was something precious. There was something familiar about his playing style, something that nagged at the edges of Danny's memory like a half-remembered dream. He pulled up Google and typed Lucas Street Musician, but found nothing useful. Then he tried Luke Sterling, a name that had popped into his head for reasons he couldn't explain. The search results made his breath catch. Luke Sterling, rising star, disappears from music scene. Read a headline from 1994. Danny clicked the link, his heart pounding as a grainy photo loaded a young man with a guitar, smiling at the camera with the kind of confidence that came from believing the world was full of possibilities. It was Lucas. 30 years younger, but unmistakably the same man. Danny scrolled through the article, his sense of unease growing with every paragraph. Luke Sterling had been a rising songwriter in the early 90s, signed to a small independent label, getting radio play, touring with established acts. Industry insiders had called him the next big thing, comparing his songwriting to James Taylor and his guitar work to Mark Knopfler. Then, suddenly, he was gone. The article mentioned a family crisis, medical bills, a career derailed by circumstances beyond his control. There were quotes from his label about pursuing other opportunities and artistic differences. But reading between the lines, Danny could see the real story. A talented musician crushed by an industry that consumed dreams as fuel. Danny's phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and for once, he was eager to answer. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, without preamble. "I saw the video. Everyone's talking about it." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just dealing with some fallout." "Dad, that man was incredible. The way he played, it was like nothing I've ever heard." "Who is he?" Danny stared at the computer screen, at Luke Sterling's young, hopeful face. "I'm trying to figure that out." "You have to find him," Emma said, and there was urgency in her voice that surprised him. "You have to apologize. What you did. I know what I did." "Do you?" "Because it's not just about the video, Dad. It's about what kind of person you've become. Mom used to say music made you a better man, but lately, the line went quiet, but Danny could hear everything she wasn't saying. Sarah had believed in him when no one else would, had seen something in his music that made her fall in love with both the man and the artist. Why had those two people become strangers to each other? "I'm going to find him," Danny said. "I'm going to make this right." After hanging up, Danny drove downtown, retracing his steps from the morning's disaster. The street corner where Lucas had been sitting was empty now, but the building owner, an elderly Korean man sweeping his sidewalk, remembered seeing him. "He comes by sometimes," the man said in careful English. Very polite. "Never makes trouble. Usually sits there in the afternoons when the sun hits that wall. Do you know where he goes? Where he lives?" The man shrugged. "Shelter, maybe. There's one a few blocks over. They serve dinner around 6. The shelter was a converted warehouse painted institutional green, with small windows and a sign that had seen better decades. Inside, the smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of too many people in too small a space. Danny approached the front desk, where a tired-looking woman with kind eyes was sorting through paperwork. "I'm looking for someone," Danny said. "Goes by Lucas, middle-aged, carries a guitar case." The woman looked up, studying Danny's face with the practiced wariness of someone who dealt with too many people looking for someone for the wrong reasons. "Are you family?" "No, Danny struggled with how to explain. "I met him today. I need to apologize for something. Lucas comes in for dinner sometimes, but he doesn't stay overnight. He's got his own arrangements." She paused, then added, "He's a good man. Quiet, respectful. Helps in the kitchen when we're short-handed. Do you know his last name? Where he's from?" The woman's expression hardened slightly. "We don't interrogate people here. If someone wants to share their story, they share it. If they don't, that's their business." Danny left his contact information and asked the woman to give it to Lucas if she saw him. As he walked back to his car, he noticed a flyer taped to a lamppost. "Community concert tonight, St. Mark's Church. All welcome." Something made him drive to St. Mark's, a small brick church in a neighborhood that had seen better days but still maintained its dignity. The parking lot was modest, filled with older cars and a few bicycles chained to the fence. Through the windows, Danny could see warm light and hear the soft murmur of conversation. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a small raised area that served as a stage. The congregation was eclectic elderly parishioners, young families, a few people who looked like they might have come from the shelter. And there, in the back row, sat Lucas. He had cleaned up, his hair was pulled back, his beard trimmed, his clothes neater than they'd been on the street. The guitar case rested beside his chair, and he was listening intently to a teenage girl who was nervously singing a hymn, while her grandmother played an old, upright piano. Danny slipped into a seat near the back, trying to remain inconspicuous. The girl finished her song to warm applause, and the pastor, a middle-aged black man with a gentle voice, invited anyone else who wanted to share music to come forward. Lucas stood up slowly, guitar case in hand, and walked to the front. As he began to tune his instrument, the room felt quiet with anticipation. Clearly, this wasn't his first time playing here. "This is for Sarah," Lucas said quietly, and began to play. The song was different from what he'd played on the street, gentler, more intimate, like a lullaby or a prayer. Danny recognized it as a classic hymn, but Lucas had arranged it in a way that made it feel completely new, completely personal. His voice, when he began to sing, was rough around the edges, but honest, telling a story of love and loss and hope that transcended any particular faith thought. As Danny listened, he felt something shift inside him, the same recognition he'd experienced on the street corner, but deeper now, more profound. This wasn't just exceptional musicianship. This was a man pouring his soul out through 6 strings in his voice, sharing something sacred with anyone willing to listen. The song ended to reverent silence, then gentle applause. Lucas nodded his thanks and returned to his seat, but Danny could see tears in the eyes of several listeners. Whatever Lucas had shared wasn't just music, it was healing. After the concert, as people filtered out into the night, Danny approached Lucas carefully. Up close, he could see the man was older than he'd first thought, probably closer to 60. But his eyes still held that same clarity that had struck Danny earlier. "Lucas," Danny said. I'm Danny Voss. We met. I remember, Lucas said calmly. The cameras. I came to apologize. What I did today was wrong. I was cruel and condescending, and you didn't deserve that. Lucas studied Danny's face for a long moment. Why are you here? The question was simple, but Danny found himself struggling with the answer. Why was he here? Because his daughter was ashamed of him? Because the video made him look like a fool? Because his comeback was derailed before it started? Because I think I've lost something, Danny said finally. Something important. And watching you play today both times, I remembered what it was. Lucas picked up his guitar case, and for a moment, Danny thought the man was going to walk away again. Instead, Lucas said, "Would you like to get some coffee? There's a diner down the street that stays open late." The diner was one of those places that existed outside of time-red vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a jukebox that probably hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration, and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Danny and Lucas sat across from each other in a corner booth, the guitar case propped against the wall like a third party to their conversation. "I looked you up," Danny said, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug for warmth. "Luke Sterling. You had quite a career started." Lucas stirred cream into his coffee with deliberate slowness. "That was a long time ago. The article said you just disappeared. One day you were touring with established acts. The next day you were gone. What happened?" For a moment, Danny thought Lucas wasn't going to answer. The older man stared out the window at the empty street, where streetlights created pools of yellow in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "My wife got sick." The words came out simply, without drama or self-pity. "Sarah. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor said we had maybe 6 months if we were lucky." Danny felt something cold settle in his stomach. He thought of his own ex-wife Sarah, how their marriage had crumbled under the pressure of his career, his ego, his inability to see past his own needs. The treatment was experimental, expensive. Insurance didn't cover much. I had to choose between my career and her life. Lucas looked directly at Danny. It wasn't really a choice. "How long did you have together?" 3 years. 3 years longer than the doctors promised. A small smile crossed Lucas's face. "We made them count. And after I was broke. The house was gone, sold to pay medical bills. My label had dropped me for breaching contract when I canceled the tour. Other musicians had moved on, found new collaborators. The industry doesn't wait for you to grieve." Danny thought about his own career, how many times he'd seen talented people disappear from the scene, usually attributed to artistic differences or pursuing other opportunities. He'd never wondered about the human cost, the stories behind the sanitized press releases. "That was 25 years ago," Danny said. "What have you been doing since?" "Living," Lucas said simply. "Working when I could find it. Construction. Kitchen work, whatever paid enough to keep me fed and housed. Playing music when I needed to remember who I was underneath everything else." "But your talent, someone with your ability, should be recording, touring, making a living from music." Lucas's laugh was gentle but tired. "Should be according to who? The same industry that discarded me when I became inconvenient? The same system that values youth and marketability over craft and authenticity?" The words stung because they were true. Danny had benefited from that system, had been one of its success stories, but he'd also seen it from the inside. He knew how quickly the industry could turn on you, how precarious even established careers could be. "I saw you at the church," Danny said. "You play there regularly?" "When Pastor Williams needs someone. They've got a good community there, people who understand that music can heal, that it's not always about performance or profit." Danny thought about his own relationship with music, how it had become transactional over the years. When was the last time he'd played just for the joy of it? just because the music needed to come out. "I've been watching the video," Lucas said suddenly. "The one from today. People are saying things about you." Danny winced. "Nothing I don't deserve. Maybe. But I've been in this business long enough to know that one moment doesn't define a person's entire career. You've made music that meant something to people. That was a long time ago. Lately, I feel like I'm just going through the motions, trying to recapture something that might never have been real in the first place." Lucas leaned back in the booth, studying Danny with those clear eyes. "Tell me about the first time you knew you wanted to be a musician." The question caught Danny off guard. He'd been asked about his influences, his creative process, his business philosophy countless times in interviews, but no one had ever asked about that first moment of recognition. "I was 12, Danny said slowly. "My parents had taken me to see a concert at the Hollywood Bowl, some folk singer I'd never heard of. But when he started playing, it was like," Danny paused, searching for words, "like he was speaking directly to something inside me that I didn't even know existed." "What was the song?" "Fire and Rain, James Taylor. I went home that night and begged my parents for a guitar. Saved up money from mowing lawns and washing cars until I could afford a cheap acoustic from a pawn shop." "And what did you feel when you first played a song all the way through?" Danny closed his eyes, remembering. "Like I'd found the language I was meant to speak. Like everything else was just noise, and music was the signal I'd been searching for." When he opened his eyes, Lucas was nodding. "That feeling doesn't go away," he said. "It just gets buried sometimes under contracts and expectations and the weight of other people's opinions." A comfortable silence settled between them. The diner was nearly empty now. Just them and an elderly man at the counter, nursing a piece of pie and reading a paperback novel. The jukebox played an old country song, something about lost love and second chances. "I should tell you," Lucas said eventually, "I know who you are. Not just from today, but from before. I was a fan back in the day. Your guitar work on Midnight Highway got me through some dark times after Sarah died." Danny felt a flush of something, pride maybe, or validation. It had been a long time since someone had mentioned his music with genuine appreciation rather than nostalgia or pity. "That song was about my first heartbreak," Danny said. 16 years old, thought the world was ending because Jennifer Morrison chose Tommy Carlyle over me for the winter formal. Music doesn't have to come from profound places to touch people profoundly, Lucas said. Sometimes the small heartbreaks prepare us for understanding the big ones. Danny's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "We need to talk about damage control. The video is everywhere, and not in a good way." "My manager," Danny explained, showing Lucas the message. "He's probably having panic attacks about my brand. What do you want to do about the video?" It was a simple question, but Danny realized he'd been so focused on the fallout that he hadn't really considered what he wanted. The old Danny would have immediately gone into crisis management mode, issue an apology, do some charity work for the cameras, wait for the internet to move on to the next scandal. "I want to find a way to make it right," Danny said. "Not for the cameras or for my career, but because it was wrong. Because you deserve better." Lucas smiled, the first genuine smile Danny had seen from him. "You know what would make it right. Tell me. Learn something from it. Use it to remember why you started making music in the first place." As they prepared to leave the diner, Lucas pulled a small card from his wallet. It was worn and faded, with an address written in careful handwriting. "This is where I volunteer," he said, handing Danny the card. "St. Catherine's Hospital, Pediatric Ward. I play for the kids sometimes, help them forget they're sick for a while." Danny looked at the card, then at Lucas. "You're inviting me?" "I'm suggesting that if you really want to remember what music is for, you might start by playing for people who need it rather than people who expect it." Outside the diner, they stood awkwardly by their cars, Danny's sleek BMW in Lucas's absence of any vehicle at all. "How do you get around?" Danny asked. "Bus, mostly. Sometimes I walk. It's not so bad once you get used to it." Danny felt a stab of guilt thinking about his BMW, his other car sitting unused in his garage, while Lucas navigated the city on foot and public transportation. "Can I give you a ride somewhere?" Danny offered. "I'm fine, but thank you." They stood there for a moment in the cool night air. Two men from completely different worlds who had somehow found common ground in music and mutual recognition of loss. "Lucas," Danny said as they prepared to part ways, "would you mind if I came with you to the hospital sometime? To volunteer, I mean. I'd like to learn how to do what you do." Lucas studied Danny's face in the streetlight, perhaps looking for signs of genuine intention versus guilt-driven charity. "It's not about performing," Lucas said finally. "It's not about impressing anyone or getting recognition. It's about showing up when people need you, especially when they can't give you anything back." "I understand. Do you?" "Because there's no cameras there, no social media content, no comeback story. Just sick kids who need to remember that beauty still exists in the world." Danny thought about his empty mansion, his tarnished Grammy, his daughter's disappointed text messages. "Maybe that's exactly what I need to remember too." Lucas smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression Danny had seen from him. "Meet me at St. Catherine's tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Bring an acoustic guitar if you have one." "And Danny?" "Yeah?" "Dog. Try to save anyone. Just show up and be present. Sometimes that's the most healing thing music can do." As Lucas walked away into the night, Danny sat in his car for a long time, watching him disappear around a corner. The man carried himself with a dignity that homelessness and illness couldn't touch, a grace that came from somewhere deeper than circumstances. Danny thought about the last time he'd played music without expecting anything in return, without hoping for applause, without calculating its impact on his career, without measuring its value in streams or sales. He couldn't remember when that had been, which told him everything he needed to know about how far he drifted from the reasons he'd started making music in the first place. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Video now at 8 million views. 3 labels want to meet about the comeback series. Strike while iron is hot." Danny stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. Tomorrow, he would go to a children's hospital and learn what it meant to use music as medicine instead of marketing. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey back to becoming the kind of man his music had always pretended he was. But tonight, driving home through the empty streets of Los Angeles, Danny Voss felt something he hadn't experienced in years' anticipation. Not for success or recognition, but for the simple opportunity to be useful, to matter in someone else's life in a way that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with human connection. The city lights blurred past, his windows like fallen stars, each one representing someone's dreams, struggles, hopes, and heartbreaks. For the first time in decades, Danny felt connected to that vast human experience rather than isolated from it by wealth and celebrity. Lucas had given him that gift, the chance to rejoin the world instead of just performing for it. When he reached his mansion, Danny didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he sat in his driveway looking up at the house that had once represented everything he thought. He wanted the tangible proof of his success, his importance, his worth. Now it just looked like what it was, an oversized monument to loneliness, impressive from a distance but hollow at its core. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would learn what Lucas already knew, that the most important music happens not on stages or in recording studios, but in hospital rooms and homeless shelters and anywhere else. People need to be reminded that they're not forgotten, that their stories matter, that love persists even in the darkest places. Danny finally got out of his car and walked toward his empty house. But for the first time in months, the emptiness didn't feel like failure. It felt like possibility space waiting to be filled with something real, something meaningful, something worthy of the second chance he was just beginning to understand he'd been given. The next morning, Danny found himself standing outside a modest apartment complex in East Hollywood, holding a bag of groceries and feeling more nervous than he had before his first Grammy nomination. He'd spent the night researching transitional housing programs and had managed to track down where Lucas was staying, the studio apartment in a building that housed people getting back on their feet. Lucas answered the door in a worn flannel shirt and jeans, his hair damp from a shower. He looked surprised but not displeased to see Danny standing there. "I brought breakfast," Danny said, holding up the bag. "I thought maybe we could talk some more." Lucas stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small but immaculately clean, with a single bed, a kitchenette, and one window that faced east toward the mountains. What struck Danny most was how sparse it was. Just the essentials, nothing extra, nothing wasted. On a small table by the window sat Lucas's guitar case and a few books, including what looked like a well-worn Bible and a collection of poetry. "Nice place," Danny said, meaning it. There was something peaceful about the simplicity, something that made his own mansion feel bloated and hollow by comparison. "It's enough," Lucas said, taking the groceries. "More than enough, really. I've learned to appreciate having what I need rather than wanting what I don't have." They made breakfast. Together eggs, toast, coffee that Lucas brewed carefully in a French press. As they cooked, Danny found himself studying the only personal items visible, a framed photograph on the nightstand showing Lucas with a woman who must have been Sarah. She was pretty in an understated way, with kind eyes and a smile that suggested she was laughing at something Lucas had just said. "She was beautiful," Danny said. Lucas glanced at the photo, and his expression softened. She was. But more than that, she was good. Really good, in a way that made everyone around her want to be better. "How did you meet?" "Coffee shop near the university." She was studying to be a nurse, working part-time behind the counter. "I was playing open mic nights, trying to get noticed by anyone who might help my career." Lucas smiled at the memory. "She was the only person who requested the same song 3 weeks in a row." "What song?" "Something I'd written called Promise Me Tomorrow. It wasn't very good. Too earnest, too romantic for the grunge era. But she said it made her believe in the possibility of being loved that completely." Danny felt a pang of recognition. He thought about his own marriage, how it had started with that same sense of possibility, that feeling that together they could create something beautiful and lasting. When had it become about competing instead of creating? They ate at the small table by the window, watching the morning light creep across the mountains. Lucas wore a thin gold chain around his neck, and when he leaned forward to reach for the salt, Danny caught a glimpse of what hung from it, a simple wedding band. "You still wear it," Danny observed. Lucas touched the chain reflexively. Some promises don't end just because circumstances change. After breakfast, Lucas surprised Danny by suggesting they go for a walk. "There's something I want to show you," he said, picking up his guitar case. They took the bus downtown, Lucas navigating the public transportation system with the ease of long practice. Danny felt conspicuous without his car, aware of people recognizing him, phones coming out to capture the odd sight of a former rock star riding the metro. Lucas led them to a small park Danny had never noticed, despite driving past it countless times. It was wedged between office buildings, more of a courtyard really, with a few benches and some struggling trees. But in the center was a small amphitheater where a group of musicians had gathered for what looked like an impromptu jam session. "This happens most mornings," Lucas explained. "People on their way to work, retirees, students, anyone who wants to play. No permits, no admission, no agenda except making music together." They sat on a bench and listened as a saxophonist traded solos with a guitarist while a woman with a gem kept rhythm. The music was imperfect but joyful, the kind of spontaneous collaboration that Danny hadn't experienced in years. When the song ended, the musicians nodded at each other, smiled, and made room for whoever wanted to play next. "Your turn," Lucas said, nodding toward the small stage. "I don't have a guitar. Someone will lend you one. That's how it works here." Danny felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the performance anxiety that had never quite gone away despite decades on stage. But this was different. There were no cameras, no critics, no expectations beyond the simple desire to contribute something to the collective music. Young man with dreadlocks and a vintage Gibson offered to let Danny borrow his guitar. "Just don't break it, dude," he said with a grin. Danny stepped into the circle, feeling the weight of the instrument, the familiar comfort of his fingers finding the fretboard. He started with something simple, a basic blues progression in E, letting his hands remember what they knew. The other musicians listened for a moment, then began to join in, the saxophone finding harmonies, the drummer adding subtle syncopation, a woman with a violin adding ethereal counter-dash melodies. For the first time in months, Danny felt connected to something larger than himself. The music wasn't about him or his reputation or his comeback. It was about the collective creation of something beautiful in the moment. When the song ended naturally, the small audience of early commuters and park regulars applauded appreciatively, but without the desperate intensity of fans seeking something from him. "How did that feel?" Lucas asked as they walked away from the park. "Like remembering how to breathe," Danny said. They spent the rest of the morning walking through neighborhoods Danny had never explored, despite living in Los Angeles for 30 years. Lucas seemed to know every corner, every shop owner, every regular at the bus stops. He introduced Danny to Maria, who ran a taco truck and had been saving money to buy her son a guitar, to James, a veteran who played harmonica outside the VA clinic, to Sister Catherine, an elderly nun who organized food drives and had been looking for someone to help with a benefit concert for the shelter. "You know everyone," Danny observed. "When you slow down enough to really see people, you realize how much goodness there is in the world," Lucas said. "How much talent and kindness just waiting for someone to notice." That afternoon, Lucas took Danny to St. Catherine's Hospital, where they signed in as volunteers and made their way to the pediatric ward. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, but the walls were painted with bright murals of animals and cartoon characters, an attempt to make the space less intimidating for young patients in the children's cancer ward. Lucas introduced Danny to Nurse Patricia, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and endless patience. "Lucas is our secret weapon," she told Danny. "When the kids are having a bad day, when the treatments are rough, he comes and plays, and somehow everything feels a little more manageable." They went from room to room, Lucas carrying his guitar, stopping to visit children who were excited to see him. 8-year-old Maria, bald from chemotherapy but bright-eyed, requested the song about the dancing elephant. 12-year-old Marcus, who was between surgeries, wanted to hear something cool. So Lucas played a simplified version of a Johnny Cash song that made the boy grin. In the last room, they met Emma, not Danny's daughter, but a 6-year-old girl with leukemia who had been in the hospital for 2 months. She was shy at first, hiding behind her stuffed rabbit, but when Lucas began playing a gentle lullaby, she sat up in bed and listened with complete attention. "Do you know any Princess songs?" she asked in a whisper. Lucas looked at Danny, then back at Emma. "I know one," he said, "but I might need some help with it." He began playing a melody Danny recognized as "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," but slowed down and simplified, turned into something that sounded like it belonged in a fairy tale. Without thinking, Danny began to hum along, then quietly sing the words, changing them slightly to make them more about princesses and castles and brave knights. Emma clapped when they finished, the first time she'd smiled since they'd entered. the room. As they prepared to leave, she called out, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Lucas squeezed her hand gently. "If I can, sweetheart. If I can." Outside in the hospital parking lot, Danny felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The sense that he had used his talent for something that mattered. Something beyond ego or profit or fame. "How often do you come here?" he asked. "Twice a week, usually. Sometimes more if they need me." "And you just play for them? No payment, no recognition?" Lucas looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Danny, when that little girl smiled, did you feel paid?" That evening, back at his empty mansion, Danny called Emma. His daughter answered on the second ring, which was unusual lately. Their conversations had been relegated to voicemail tags. "Dad, is everything okay?" "I spent the day with him," Danny said. "The musician from the video. His name is Lucas." "What's he like?" Danny looked around his house, at all the gold records and magazine covers and expensive furniture that suddenly felt meaningless. "He's what I used to think I was," he said finally. "He's what I want to be again." 3 weeks later, Danny's life had taken on a rhythm he hadn't experienced in decades. He spent mornings at the park with the informal musician circle, afternoons volunteering at the hospital with Lucas, and evenings learning to cook simple meals instead of ordering takeout to his empty mansion. Marcus had been calling less frequently, frustrated by Danny's refusal to capitalize on the viral video's momentum. "You're missing opportunities," Marcus had argued during their last conversation. "The homeless musician angle is gold. People want authenticity, and this guy is the real deal. We could set up a collaboration, maybe get him cleaned up, put him in some decent clothes." Danny had hung up mid-sentence. The truth was, the more time he spent with Lucas, the more he realized how much he'd lost touch with everything that had made him want to be a musician in the first place. Lucas played because music was as essential as breathing. He shared his talent freely, without calculation or expectation of return. He found joy in teaching a child 3 chords or helping an elderly man remember a song from his youth. But Danny was also becoming aware of something else, a growing sense that Lucas was holding something back, some deeper pain that music alone couldn't reach Don. It was a Thursday afternoon at the hospital when Danny first noticed the tremor in Lucas's hands. They were visiting the teenage ward, playing for a group of kids who were dealing with various long-term illnesses. Lucas was in the middle of the song when his left hand began to shake slightly, just enough to affect his fingering. Lucas stopped playing abruptly, flexing his fingers and shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "Sorry," he said to the kids. "Let me try that again." But Danny had seen the flash of something in Lucas's eyes, not embarrassment, but fear. After they left the hospital, Danny brought it up carefully. "Everything okay? You seemed a little off today." "Just tired," Lucas said. But he wasn't meeting Danny's eyes. That weekend, Danny convinced Lucas to come to his house for dinner. It was the first time Lucas had seen where Danny lived, and his reaction was what Danny had expected, a kind of quiet amazement at the excess of it all. "This is some place," Lucas said, looking out at the ocean view from the living room windows. "It's too big," Danny admitted. "I bought it thinking I'd fill it with family, friends, music. Instead, it just echoes." They cooked together in Danny's restaurant-quality kitchen, Lucas marveling at appliances that cost more than most people's cars. As they prepared a simple pasta dinner, Danny noticed Lucas struggling with the can opener, his hands shaking enough that he had to stop and steady himself against the counter. "Lucas," Danny said gently, "what's going on with your hands?" For a moment, Lucas looked like he might deflect again, but then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Parkinson's," he said quietly. "Early stages, but it's progressing." Danny felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "How long have you known?" "About a year. Maybe a little more. Are you getting treatment?" Lucas's laugh was bitter. You know what Parkinson's medication costs? What any kind of consistent medical care costs when you don't have insurance, don't have a permanent address, don't have anyone to vouch for you. Danny set down the wooden spoon he'd been holding. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That I'm dying? That every day I can feel my body betraying me a little more? That soon I won't be able to play guitar, won't be able to do the one thing that's kept me sane for the past 25 years. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of water boiling on the stove. Danny watched Lucas's hands, noticing now what he'd missed before. The way Lucas had been gripping his guitar neck more tightly lately. The occasional pause to flex his fingers, the look of concentration when he played passages that should have been automatic. There's got to be something we can do, Danny said. Specialists, treatments, clinical trials. Danny, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not your redemption project. The words stung because they contained just enough. Truth to hurt. Is that what you think this is? Lucas looked at him steadily. Isn't it? Rich rock star feels bad about humiliating homeless musician. Decides to play savior to make himself feel better. No, Danny said, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. No, that's not what this is. Or maybe it started that way, but it's not what it is now. Then what is it? Danny struggled to find words for something he was only beginning to understand himself. You're my friend, he said finally. Maybe the first real friend I've had in years. And friends help each other. Lucas's expression softened slightly. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Danny. I don't need charity. This isn't charity. This is, Danny paused, realizing something. You've been teaching me something these past few weeks. About music, about what it means to be human. Let me give something back. They finished cooking in thoughtful silence, the weight of Lucas's revelation hanging between them. Over dinner, Danny steered the conversation towards safer ground memories of concerts they both attended in the 80s, musicians they'd admired, the changing landscape of the music industry. But as the evening wore on, Danny found himself studying Lucas more carefully, seeing signs he'd missed before. The way Lucas moved more deliberately than necessary, the careful precision with which he held his fork, the occasional pause in conversation while he seemed to be listening to something inside his own body. How much time do you think you have? Danny asked as they were cleaning up. Before it gets worse, I mean. Lucas dried a plate slowly, considering the question. Everyone's different. Could be years, could be months. The doctors aren't big on specifics when you're paying out of pocket for 10-minute consultations. But you're still playing. Still. Teaching those kids. For now, every day is a gift. Every song might be the last one that comes out the way I intended to. After Lucas left that night, Danny sat in his empty living room, looking out at the dark ocean and thinking about time, how he'd wasted so much of it, how he'd taken his health and his talent and his opportunities for granted. He thought about Lucas in his small apartment, probably lying awake wondering how many more mornings he'd wake up with steady hands. The next day, Danny made some phone calls. He started with his own doctor, Dr. Reynolds, who'd been treating him for minor ailments and anxiety for years. Dr. Reynolds gave him names of neurologists, movement disorder specialists, research hospitals with clinical trials. Then he called his accountant, his lawyers, his financial advisor. By the end of the day, he'd set up a medical fund, researched the best treatment centers in the country, and begun the process of getting Lucas enrolled in a comprehensive care program. But when he presented all of this to Lucas the next afternoon at the hospital, the reaction wasn't what he'd expected. I can't accept this, Lucas said simply. They were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, Lucas's guitar case propped against his chair. Around them, medical staff grabbed quick meals between shifts. Families huddled over coffee and worry. The constant hum of an institution that never slept. Why not? Because this is exactly what I was afraid of. You're trying to fix my life because it makes you feel better about yours. That's not. Danny, I appreciate what you're trying to do. I really do, but I've been poor for a long time. I've learned to live with uncertainty, with discomfort, with the knowledge that tomorrow might be worse than today. Peace isn't about having enough money to solve your problems. It's about accepting the problems you can't solve. Danny felt frustration rising in his chest. So you're just going to give up? Stop fighting? I'm not giving up. I'm choosing what to fight for. Lucas gestured toward the pediatric ward above them. Those kids up there, they don't have choices about what's happening to their bodies. But they still find ways to laugh, to hope, to appreciate a simple song. If they can do that, so can I. But treatment could slow the progression, give you more time. More time for what? To worry about symptoms? To focus on what I'm losing instead of what I still have? Danny stared at his friend, trying to understand how someone could be so calm about facing such a devastating diagnosis. Don't you want to fight this? Lucas smiled, and in that smile, Danny saw something he'd been missing, not resignation, but a kind of grace he'd never learned to cultivate. I am fighting, Lucas said. I'm fighting to make every day count. I'm fighting to keep playing as long as I can. I'm fighting to find meaning in whatever time I have left. He paused, studying Danny's face. The question is, what are you fighting for? That night, Danny couldn't sleep. He walked through his mansion, past the gold records and magazine covers, past the expensive furniture and state-of-the-art sound system, and felt the emptiness of it all pressing down on him like a weight. He'd spent 30 years accumulating things, chasing recognition, building a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow at its core. In his home studio, he picked up one of his vintage guitars, a 1965 Stratocaster that had cost him more than most people made in a year. He plugged it into a small amp and began to play softly, just for himself. The music that came out wasn't polished or sophisticated. It was rough, emotional, honest. The kind of playing he'd done as a teenager in his bedroom, when music was still a secret language between him and the universe. He played until his fingers ached, until the sun began to rise over the Pacific, until he finally understood what Lucas had been trying to teach him. It wasn't about the time you had. It was about what you did with the time you were given. Danny was cleaning out his storage unit on a sweltering Saturday morning, driven by a sudden need to declutter his life that matched his internal transformation. Boxes that hadn't been opened in years yielded treasures and trash in equal measure to our memorabilia. Old equipment, contracts, and paperwork from the height of his career. It was in a box labeled 1993 to 1995 legal that he found the manila envelope. That would change everything. Inside were contracts from Meridian Records, the label he'd been signed to during his biggest commercial period. Most of the documents were routine recording agreements, tour contracts, royalty statements. But one contract made his blood run cold. Songwriter Acquisition Agreement, the header read. Luke Sterling demo recordings and compositions. Danny's hands began to shake as he read through the legal language. The contract, dated March 1994, transferred the rights to 6 original compositions from Luke Sterling to Meridian Records for the sum of $15,000. The songs were listed by title, and Danny recognized every one of them because he had recorded them under his own name, as his own compositions. Promise Me Tomorrow had become Midnight Highway, his biggest hit. Sarah's Lullaby had been reworked as Angel's Dream, the power ballad that had spent 12 weeks at #1. Road Back Home had become Thunder Road, the song that had defined his entire sound in the mid-90s. Danny sank onto a cardboard box, the contract, trembling in his hands. At the bottom of the page, Luke Sterling's signature was shaky, desperate, the signature of a man who had run out of options. In the corner, a notation read, Medical Emergency Expedited Payment Approved. A second document in the envelope made everything worse. It was a memo from his A&R representative at the time, a man named Richard Thornton, who'd been Danny's primary contact at the label. "Danny, these songs from the Sterling acquisition are perfect for your new album direction. I've taken the liberty of having our team polish them up a bit, but the bones are solid gold." Sterling was going through some personal issues and needed quick cash. Lucky for us, unlucky for him. These tracks could define your career. RT. Danny remembered Richard Thornton, clearly a smooth-talking executive who'd promised to make Danny a superstar who'd guided his career through its most successful period. Danny had trusted him completely, had been grateful when Richard presented him with songs that seemed tailor-made for his voice and style. He'd never asked where the songs came from. He'd been too hungry for success, too eager to believe that his career was destined for greatness. When Richard said the songs were from a developing songwriter who wanted to remain anonymous, Danny had simply nodded and started learning the arrangement stuff now, 29 years later. Sitting in a storage unit that smelled like dust and regret, Danny understood the full scope of what had happened. Luke Sterling had sold his songs to pay for Sarah's medical treatment. Those songs had become the foundation of Danny's greatest commercial success. And Lucas had never seen another penny from compositions that had generated millions in revenue. Danny's phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. How could he explain to his daughter that her father's career had been built on theft? That the royalties that had paid for her private school, her college education, her comfortable childhood had come from a dying man's desperate attempt to save his wife? Instead, he drove directly to Lucas's apartment, the contracts burning like evidence in the passenger seat of his BMW. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, his heart pounding with each step, and knocked on the door with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Lucas opened the door, took one look at Danny's face, and stepped aside without a word. "I found something," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In my storage unit. Contracts from my old label." He handed the manila envelope to Lucas and watched as his friend's face went through a series of transformations. Confusion, recognition, pain, and finally, a kind of tired resignation. "You know about the songs," Lucas said. It wasn't a question. "Some of my biggest hits. Midnight Highway, Angel's Dream, Thunder Road. They were yours. All of them." Lucas set the contracts on his small table and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that were barely visible through the Los Angeles smog. "Sarah was dying," he said quietly. "The experimental treatment was our last hope, but it cost $40,000 up front. Insurance wouldn't cover it because it was still in trials. I'd already sold everything else: the house, the car, my good guitars. These songs were all I had left." $15,000, Danny said, reading from the contract. "They bought your songs for $15,000, which was more money than I'd seen in months." Richard Thornton made it sound like a favor said. The label would develop the songs, maybe record demos, see if they could place them with established artists. He never mentioned that they'd already decided to give them to you. Danny felt sick. "Lucas, I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea where those songs came from. Richard told me they were from an anonymous songwriter who wanted to remain behind the scenes." "I know you didn't know," Lucas said, turning from the window. "I've watched you these past few weeks. You're not the kind of person who would knowingly steal from someone, but that doesn't change what happened. The royalties," Danny began, "made you millions, I'm sure. While I was washing dishes and living in shelters, you were performing my songs on national television, getting Grammy nominations for compositions I wrote in my living room while Sarah slept on the couch." The words hung in the air between them, like an accusation and an absolution all at once. Danny wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd worked hard, that he'd earned his success in other ways. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. His greatest achievements had been built on another man's desperation. "Promise Me Tomorrow," Lucas continued, was the song I wrote for Sarah when she was first diagnosed. I played it for her in the hospital the night before her first surgery. It was about hope, about believing that love could survive anything. Danny closed his eyes, remembering the countless times he'd performed Midnight Highway for screaming crowds, the way he'd always felt a strange disconnect from the lyrics, as if he was singing someone else's story. "What can I do?" Danny asked. "How can I make this right?" Lucas was quiet for a long time, studying the contracts with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust legal documents. "You can't give me back 30 years, he said finally. "You can't give me back Sarah, or the career I might have had, or the recognition for those songs. But I can give you the royalties, all of them. Everything those songs have earned, everything they'll earn in the future." "Danny, no, listen to me. I've made enough money from your work to last several lifetimes. I'd bought houses and cars, and guitars with royalties from songs you wrote. The least I can do is give you what was always rightfully yours." Lucas picked up the framed photo of Sarah from his nightstand, studying her face as if looking for guidance. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something I never told you about that day we first met, when you asked me to play on the street." Danny waited, afraid of what was coming next. "I recognized you immediately. I'd been following your career for years, watching you perform my songs, wondering if you knew where they'd come from. When you asked me to play, there was a part of me that wanted to tell you who I was, to see your reaction when you realized you were talking to the man who'd written your biggest hits. Why didn't you? Because I saw something in your face that day: desperation, fear, the look of a man who was losing everything. I realized you weren't the enemy. You were just another musician trying to survive in an industry that chews people up and spits them out." Danny felt tears forming in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Lucas. I'm sorry for what happened to you. Sorry for what I unknowingly took. Sorry for all of it. I forgave you before you even knew there was anything to forgive." Lucas said simply, "The question is, can you forgive yourself?" That evening, Danny called Emma and told her everything. The conversation lasted 2 hours, with his daughter cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally, a kind of proud sadness. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Give him everything. The royalties, the publishing rights, the writing credits, and then figure out how to live with knowing that my whole career was built on someone else's foundation." "Dad," Emma said quietly, "maybe this isn't about your career. Maybe this is about who you choose to be from now on." After hanging up, Danny sat in his empty mansion and thought about choices, the ones he'd made, the ones he hadn't, and the ones that still lay ahead of him. Outside, the Pacific Ocean stretched toward the horizon, vast and indifferent, holding secrets beneath its surface that might never see the light. But some secrets, Danny realized, were meant to be revealed. Some wrongs were meant to be righted, regardless of the cost. And sometimes, the most important thing a person could do was figure out how to transform guilt into grace, regret into redemption. He picked up his phone and began researching entertainment, lawyers who specialized in copyright law. By morning, he would begin the process of undoing 30 years of injustice. It wouldn't give Lucas back his health, his wife, or his lost years, but it might give both of them something equally valuable: the chance to make their remaining time count for something real. The legal documents spread across Danny's dining room table like evidence at a crime scene. For 3 weeks, teams of lawyers had been working to untangle 30 years of copyright ownership, royalty distribution, and publishing rights. The paperwork was dense, intimidating, and expensive, but Danny had never been more certain of anything in his life. Margaret Chun, the entertainment attorney he'd hired, looked exhausted as she explained the complexities of transferring song ownership retroactively. The good news is that we can establish clear evidence of the original theft through the Meridian Records contracts, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. The bad news is that some of the royalties have already been distributed to multiple parties over the years: record labels, publishers, performance rights organizations. Getting every penny back will be nearly impossible. What percentage can we recover? Danny asked. Conservatively, 80% of past royalties, plus full future earnings. We're talking about approximately $3.2 million in back payments, plus an estimated $40,000 to $50,000 per year going forward. Danny felt the weight of those numbers. Lucas had been living in poverty while Danny collected millions from his stolen songs. The mathematics of injustice were staggering. How long before we can get him the money? 6 to 8 weeks for the initial payment, assuming he signs the new agreements. But Danny, there's something else we need to discuss. Margaret pulled out a thick folder labeled Media Strategy. Once you publicly transfer these song credits, the story is going to explode. A famous musician returning millions to the homeless. Man whose songs made him rich? That's front-page news everywhere. You need to be prepared for the attention. Danny thought about Lucas, about his quiet dignity and his desire for privacy. What if we do it quietly? No press, no announcement. You can try, but copyright transfers are public record. Entertainment reporters monitor these filings religiously. Plus, Lucas will suddenly start receiving substantial royalty checks. Someone's going to notice. That afternoon, Danny drove to Lucas's apartment to discuss the legal arrangements. He found his friend sitting on the small balcony, guitar in his lap, playing a song Danny didn't recognize. Lucas's hands were steadier today. The Parkinson's symptoms seemed to fluctuate unpredictably. "How are you feeling?" Danny asked, settling into the plastic chair beside him. "Your good days and bad days," Lucas replied, setting the guitar aside. "Today's a good day. The music still flows like it's supposed to." Danny pulled out copies of the legal documents. "I've got news about the song rights. My lawyers say they can transfer everything back to you. The copyrights, the publishing, all future royalties." Lucas studied the papers with careful attention, occasionally asking questions about specific clauses and terms. His years in the music business, brief as they'd been, had taught him to read contracts skeptically. "This is generous, Danny. More than generous. It's not generous. It's returning what was always yours. And when this becomes public? Because it will become public." Danny had been dreading this conversation. Margaret says the story will probably break within days of filing the paperwork. Entertainment media, music blogs, probably mainstream news too. Lucas leaned back in his chair, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline. "A year ago, I was invisible. People stepped around me on the street like I was just another piece of urban debris. Now I'm going to be famous again, but for being the victim in someone else's redemption story." "Lucas, I'm not complaining. I understand why this has to be public, but I want you to know that I never asked to be rescued. I made my peace with how things turned out." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light shift across the mountains. Finally, Lucas spoke again. "There's something I want to do before this all becomes a circus. Something for Sarah." He explained his idea as they walked to the bus stop. A benefit concert at St. Mark's Church, where they'd first played together. The proceeds would go to a fund for families dealing with catastrophic medical bills. People like he and Sarah had been forced to choose between financial ruin and the chance to fight for more time. "I want to play those songs one more time before they become famous again," Lucas said. "The original versions, the way I wrote them, before the world decides what they mean." Pastor Williams embraced the idea immediately when they approached him the next day. "We've been looking for a way to help our community members who are struggling with medical debt," he said. "This feels like Providence." Word spread quickly through the networks of people Lucas had touched over the years: the hospital volunteers, the shelter workers, the informal musician circle, the families he'd helped through difficult times. Within a week, they'd sold out the church's modest capacity of 200 seats. Danny threw himself into the preparations with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He arranged for professional sound equipment, coordinated with local media who'd caught wind of the story, and worked with Margaret to ensure the legal paperwork would be filed the day after the concert. But as the date approached, Danny noticed Lucas becoming more withdrawn, more anxious. His Parkinson's symptoms seemed to be worsening under the stress. His hands shook more frequently. His movements became more deliberate and careful. "I don't know if I can do this," Lucas admitted 3 days before the concert. They were sitting in the church sanctuary, testing the sound equipment. "What if my hands won't cooperate? What if I can't get through the songs?" Danny looked at his friend, seeing the fear that Lucas had been trying to hide. "Then we'll figure it out together. This isn't about a perfect performance. It's about honoring Sarah, honoring your music, honoring the truth. Easy for you to say. You're not the one whose body is betraying him." The words came out sharper than Lucas had intended, and Danny could see him immediately regret the outburst. But they were true words, and they hung in the air between them like an acknowledgement of something that couldn't be fixed. "You're right," Danny said quietly. "I can't understand what you're going through, but I know what your music means to people. I've seen it at the hospital, at the park, here in this church. Even if your hands shake, even if your voice breaks, that meaning doesn't change." The night before the concert, Emma drove down from San Francisco to attend. She met Lucas for the first time at the church during final rehearsals, and Danny watched nervously as his daughter sized up the man whose life had been so entangled with her father's. "I wanted to thank you," Emma said to Lucas after hearing him play through "Promise Me Tomorrow" for the sound check. "Thank me? For giving my dad back to me. I haven't seen him this alive, this purposeful in years. Whatever you two have been doing together, it's changed him." Lucas smiled, and Danny could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Your father's a good man, Emma. He just forgot for a while." That evening, Danny couldn't sleep. He walked through his mansion, past all the trappings of success that felt increasingly meaningless, and ended up in his home studio. He picked up his guitar, not one of the expensive vintage instruments, but a simple acoustic he'd bought years ago, and rarely played dot as his fingers found the chords. He realized he was playing "Promise Me Tomorrow," not the polished version he'd recorded as Midnight Highway, but the original arrangement as Lucas had written it. The song felt different in its pure form, more intimate, more honest. He could hear Sarah in the melody, could feel the hope and desperation that had inspired every chord change. For the first time, Danny truly understood what he'd been performing all those years. Not just a love song, but a prayer, a promise, a man's attempt to hold on to hope in the face of unimaginable loss. The morning of the concert dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp Los Angeles air that made everything seem possible. Danny arrived at the church early to find Lucas already there, sitting in the front pew with his guitar case beside him, staring at the simple wooden cross above the altar. "How are you feeling?" Danny asked, settling beside him. "Terrified," Lucas admitted, "but ready." As the afternoon wore on, people began to arrive. Danny recognized many faces from their weeks of volunteering: hospital staff, shelter workers, families they'd met in waiting rooms and community centers. But there were also strangers, people who'd heard about the concert through social media or word of mouth, drawn by curiosity or the promise of something authentic in a world full of manufactured moments. Marcus arrived an hour before showtime, looking uncomfortable in the modest church setting. He'd been calling Danny for weeks, alternately excited about the publicity potential and worried about the career implications of giving away millions in royalties. "This is either the best thing you've ever done for your image or the worst," Marcus said, adjusting his tie nervously. "I don't care about my image anymore," Danny replied, and minute dot in the small room behind the sanctuary that served as a green area. Lucas was warming up, running through scales and simple chord progressions. His hands were steadier than they'd been in days, but Danny could see the concentration it required. The way Lucas had to think about movements that had once been automatic. Pastor Williams gathered the small group: Danny, Lucas, Emma, and few church volunteers for a brief prayer before the concert began. "Lord, we ask that you bless this evening," he said, his deep voice filling the small space. "Help us to remember that music is a gift meant to be shared, that truth has the power to heal, and that it's never too late to make things right." They walked toward the sanctuary. Lucas stopped suddenly and turned to Danny. "Whatever happens out there," he said, "I want you to know that these past weeks have been a gift. For the first time since Sarah died, I felt like I had a purpose again." "You've always had a purpose," Danny replied. "You just helped me find mine." The sanctuary was full, 200 people waiting in respectful silence. As Danny and Lucas walked onto the simple stage, the audience rose in spontaneous applause, not the wild enthusiasm of a rock concert, but something deeper, more reverent. Lucas approached the microphone with his guitar, looking out at the faces in the crowd. Danny could see him taking a deep breath, centering himself, preparing to share the most personal parts of his life with a room full of strangers. "Good evening," Lucas said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Thank you for being here. Tonight is about music, but it's also about love, loss, and the power of truth to set us free." He looked directly at Danny, standing in the wings, and nodded almost imperceptibly. "Before we begin, there's something you need to know about the songs you're going to hear tonight. They were written 30 years ago, during the most difficult time of my life, when my wife Sarah was dying and I was desperate enough to sell the only things of value I had left." A murmur went through the crowd as people began to understand what they were witnessing. These songs became famous under different titles, performed by my friend Danny Voss, who had no idea where they'd come from. Tonight, we're going to play them the way they were meant to be heard, as love letters to a woman who deserved more time than this world gave her. Lucas placed his fingers on the guitar strings, looked up at the lights, and began to play the opening chords of "Promise Me Tomorrow." And in that moment, Danny realized that everything, the viral video, the discovery of the stolen songs, the weeks of friendship and music and shared purpose, had been leading to this. Lucas finally getting to tell Sarah's story in his own words, in his own way, with the whole world listening. The opening notes of "Promise Me Tomorrow" filled the sanctuary like a prayer made audible. Lucas's voice, weathered but true, began to tell the story that had lived in his heart for 30 years. Not the polished version that had made Danny famous, but the raw, honest original that had been born from love and desperation. Danny watched from the side of the stage, seeing Lucas transform before his eyes. Despite the Parkinson's, despite the years of hardship, despite everything that had been taken from him, Lucas played with a grace and power that silenced the room completely. This wasn't just a performance, it was a testimony. "I wrote this song the night Sarah was diagnosed," Lucas said softly as the last chord faded. "We were 28 years old, and suddenly we were talking about experimental treatments and second opinions and time we might not have. But that night, lying in bed, holding her hand, I promised her tomorrow. And the next day, and the next, for as long as the world would give them to us." The audience was completely still, hanging on every word. Danny could see tears in the eyes of people throughout the congregation, some who knew Lucas personally, others who were hearing his story. for the first time. The next song is called Sarah's Lullaby. Lucas continued, adjusting his guitar. Most of you probably know it as Angel's Dream. I wrote it during her first round of chemotherapy, when she couldn't sleep because of the medication. Music was the only thing that could calm her mind enough to rest. As Lucas began the gentle finger-picking pattern that opened the song, Danny felt his chest tighten with emotion. He'd performed this song hundreds of times, had always thought it was about young love and romantic dreams. Now, hearing it in its original context, he understood it was about something much more profound. A husband's desperate attempt to give his dying wife a few hours of peace. Lucas's voice cracked slightly on the chorus, but instead of detracting from the performance, it added to its authenticity. This wasn't a man trying to impress anyone. This was a man sharing the most intimate moments of his life, offering his pain as a gift to anyone who needed to know they weren't alone in their struggles. Halfway through the song, Danny noticed Lucas's left hand beginning to tremor more noticeably. The Parkinson's was asserting itself, making the complex finger-picking pattern increasingly difficult to maintain. But Lucas pressed on, his face a mask of concentration, determined to finish what he'd started. As the song built toward its climax, Lucas's hand seized completely. The melody stumbled, then stopped altogether as he stared down at his fingers in frustration and fear. The sanctuary fell silent except for the soft hum of the sound system. Danny could see Lucas struggling, trying to will his hand to cooperate. His face flushed with embarrassment and disappointment. Without thinking, Danny stepped from the wings onto the stage, carrying his own guitar. He approached the microphone beside Lucas and spoke quietly. "Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from two people playing together," he said to the audience. Then, turning to Lucas, "May I?" Lucas looked at him for a moment, vulnerability and gratitude warring in his expression. Then he nodded, and Danny began to play the finger-picking pattern that Lucas's hand could no longer manage. Together, they finished Sarah's Lullaby, Lucas singing the words he'd written for his dying wife, while Danny provided the musical foundation. The complex guitar work that had always been beyond his own technical ability, but which Lucas had taught him through years of unknowing imitation. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous but brief, as if the audience understood that this moment was too sacred for extended celebration. Lucas wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, then looked at Danny with something approaching wonder. "Thank you," Lucas whispered to Danny, then turned back to the microphone. "I never expected to need help finishing Sarah's song. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes the most important things we do, we can't do alone." Danny remained on stage as Lucas introduced the final song of the evening, Road Back Home, which the world knew as Thunder Road. But before Lucas could begin playing, he reached into his guitar case and pulled out something Danny had never seen before, a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "These are Sarah's words," Lucas said, holding up the notebook. "She wrote them during her last weeks, when she was too weak to do much besides lie in bed and watch the world through our bedroom window. She said they were lyrics for a song I'd write someday when I was ready to find my way home to her." Lucas opened the notebook carefully, as if it might crumble at his touch. "I've never performed this version before, never felt brave enough, but tonight feels like the right time." Danny watched as Lucas positioned his fingers on the guitar strings, the tremor in his left hand still visible, but more controlled now. When Lucas began to sing, his voice carried a depth of emotion that 30 years of grief and love had carved into every note. The song was different from the version Danny had recorded, slower, more contemplative, with lyrics that spoke directly to loss and hope and the long journey back to meaning after devastating heartbreak. Where Danny's version had been about adventure and possibility, Lucas's original was about finding peace in acceptance. about learning that love doesn't end when the beloved dies. As Lucas sang the final verse, something extraordinary happened. One by one, people in the audience began to hum along, not with the melody they knew from radio play, but with the one Lucas was creating in real time, as if the entire congregation was learning Sarah's song together, adding their voices to a prayer they were hearing for the first time. Danny found himself playing a simple harmonic accompaniment, following Lucas's lead rather than trying to shape the music to his own vision. For the first time in his career, he was truly accompanying someone else, supporting their artistic expression rather than using it to showcase his own. When the song ended, the silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, a congregation of 200 people sitting in perfect stillness, processing what they had just experienced. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Others joined, and soon the entire sanctuary was filled with applause that felt more like gratitude than appreciation. Lucas set down his guitar and approached the microphone one final time. His hands were shaking more noticeably now, the emotional and physical effort of the performance having taken its toll, but his voice was steady. "Music has the power to heal," he said simply. "It can't bring back the people we've lost or undo the injustices we've suffered, but it can remind us that we're not alone, that our stories matter, that love is stronger than loss." He paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd, some tearful, some smiling, all of them changed by what they had witnessed. "Tonight, we raise money for families facing medical crises. But more than that, we shared something that can't be bought or sold, the truth that our pain has purpose, that our struggles can become songs that help others find their way through the darkness." Danny stepped forward then, approaching his own microphone. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "Tomorrow morning, my lawyers will file paperwork transferring the rights to these songs back to their rightful owner. Lucas Sterling will receive full credit and all future royalties for the compositions that have been performed under my name for the past 30 years. A murmur went through the crowd as people began to understand the full scope of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a benefit concert. It was a public confession, a legal declaration, a moment of justice decades in the making. Some of you might wonder why I'm giving up millions of dollars in future earnings, Danny continued. The answer is simple. They were never mine to begin with. Lucas wrote these songs out of love for his wife, sold them out of desperation to save her life, and deserves to finally receive recognition for creating some of the most beautiful music of the past 3 decades. Lucas stood beside him, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement he had never expected to receive. When Danny handed him a beautifully crafted Martin guitar, a replacement for the battered instrument that had carried him through years of street performances and hospital visits, Lucas's composure finally broke. "This isn't about money," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about truth, about the power of friendship to transform guilt into grace, regret into redemption." Danny didn't have to do any of this, but he chose to, because that's who he is when he stops trying to be who he thinks the world wants him to be. The two men embraced on stage, and the audience rose as one, applauding not just the music they had heard, but the courage it had taken to share it, the honesty it had required to reveal it, the love that had inspired every note. In the wings, Emma wiped tears from her eyes, proud of her father in a way she hadn't been since childhood. Pastor Williams stood with his congregation, witnessing a kind of redemption that transcended religion and spoke to the fundamental human need for justice, mercy, and the possibility of second chances. As the applause finally began to fade, Lucas picked up the new guitar Danny had given him and played a few experimental chords, testing its tone and resonance. The instrument sang with a clarity and richness that his old guitar had never possessed. But when he looked up at Danny, there was something bittersweet in his expression. Sarah would have loved this, he said quietly, and Danny understood that. The gift wasn't just about replacing a worn-out instrument. It was about honoring a love that had inspired every song, every sacrifice, every moment of beauty that had emerged from their unlikely friendship. 6 months later, Danny stood in the lobby of the Sarah Sterling Center for Music Therapy, watching children with various illnesses participate in their weekly music sessions. The center occupied a renovated warehouse in downtown Los Angeles, its walls painted with colorful murals depicting musical notes, floating like butterflies among flowers and trees. Through the large windows of the main therapy room, he could see Lucas working with a group of young cancer patients, teaching them simple chord progressions on ukuleles donated by local music stores. Despite his progressing Parkinson's, Lucas had found ways to adapt his teaching methods, using voice instruction when his hands wouldn't cooperate, relying on demonstration volunteers when fine motor control became impossible. The story of the concert and the return songwrites had indeed become international news, sparking conversations about artistic ownership, corporate exploitation, and the power of late-in-life redemption. But what hadn't made headlines was what mattered most to both men, the quiet work they'd been doing together to create something lasting from their unlikely friendship. Emma joined Danny in the lobby, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the small cafe the center operated to help fund its programs. She'd moved back to Los Angeles 3 months earlier, leaving her corporate job in San Francisco to help manage the center's operations. "The afternoon session is almost full," she reported. 15 kids signed up for Lucas's songwriting workshop. "The waiting list is getting longer every week." Danny smiled, watching his friend demonstrate how to strum a ukulele using adaptive techniques he developed as his condition progressed. Lucas had become something of a celebrity in the music therapy community, not for his famous songs, but for his innovative approaches to making music accessible to people with physical limitations. "How's he doing today?" Danny asked. "Good day. His hands are steady, his voice is strong. Dr. Martinez says the medication adjustments are helping, plus the fact that he's doing work he loves makes a real difference." The first royalty payment had arrived 2 months after the concert. Nearly $3 million, representing 30 years of earnings from Lucas's stolen songs. Instead of keeping the money for medical treatment or comfortable retirement, Lucas had insisted on using most of it to establish the Music Therapy Center, keeping only enough to ensure his basic needs were met. "Money can't buy back the past," he'd told Danny when they were setting up the foundation. "But it might help build a better future for other people facing impossible choices." Danny had contributed matching funds, and together they created something neither could have achieved alone, a place where music served its highest purpose, healing rather than entertaining, connecting rather than performing. Through the window, Danny watched Lucas finish the session by leading the children in a simple song he'd written specifically for them. Not about romance or fame or personal struggles, but about courage, hope, and the magic that happened when people made music together. The children's voices, some weakened by treatment but all filled with joy, created a harmony that was more beautiful than any professional recording Danny had ever heard. As the session ended and parents began collecting their children, Lucas made his way to the lobby, moving more slowly than he had 6 months earlier, but with a sense of purpose that made him seem younger than his years. "How was the workshop?" Emma asked, giving him a gentle hug. "Magical," Lucas replied. 8-year-old Maria wrote her first song today, 3 chords and lyrics about how her teddy bear helps her be brave during treatments. I nearly cried. They walked together to Lucas's office, a small but comfortable space filled with guitars, sheet music, and photographs from the center's events. On the wall hung a framed picture from the benefit concert, showing Danny and Lucas performing together. But it shared space with dozens of photos of children, families, and volunteers who had found healing through music. Lucas settled into his desk chair with careful movements. The Parkinsons making even simple tasks require planning and patience. But his eyes were bright, focused, alive in a way that reminded Danny of their first meeting at the church. "I got a call from NPR today," Lucas said, pulling out a handwritten note. "They want to do a feature story about the center for their health segment. I told them I'd consider it if they focused on the kids and the music therapy programs rather than the celebrity angle." Danny nodded approvingly. They both learned to be selective about media attention, choosing opportunities that served the center's mission rather than their personal stories. "Speaking of calls," Emma interjected, "Rolling Stone wants to do a follow-up piece for the one-year anniversary of the concert. They're calling it The Power of Musical Justice, or something equally dramatic." "What did you tell them?" Danny asked. "That we'd get back to them. But honestly, I think you should do it. The story might inspire other artists to examine their own catalogs, maybe discover other cases where songwriters were exploited." Lucas considered this thoughtfully. "If it helps other musicians get credit for their work, I'm interested. But I want editorial approval over anything they write about Sarah. Her story isn't entertainment." As they discussed the media request, Danny found himself marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. Not just the external circumstances, the return songwrites, the center, the public recognition, but the internal transformations that had reshaped both their lives. Lucas had rediscovered his purpose, finding in music therapy a calling that combined his artistic gifts with his natural compassion. The progression of his Parkinson's had slowed, whether due to better medical care, reduced stress, or simply the healing power of meaningful work. Danny had discovered something he'd never known. He was missing the satisfaction of using his resources and reputation to create rather than accumulate, to lift up rather than compete, to serve something larger than his own ego. His relationship with Emma had deepened beyond what either had thought possible. Working together at the center had allowed them to see each other as adults, as partners in something meaningful rather than father and daughter trapped in old patterns of disappointment and guilt. "There's something else," Lucas said, reaching into his desk drawer. "Something I've been working on." He pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal pages of sheet music, handwritten in his careful script. The title page read, "Sarah's Songs, a collection of compositions by Lucas Sterling." "There are 12 songs here," Lucas explained. "Pieces I wrote for Sarah during our 3 years together after her diagnosis. I never showed them to anyone, never tried to sell them or perform them. They were too personal, too sacred." Danny and Emma leaned closer to examine the music. The compositions were complex, beautiful, filled with the kind of emotional depth that only comes from living through profound love and loss. "I want to record them," Lucas continued. "Not for commercial release, but as a gift to the families we work with here. Music that speaks directly to what they're going through, the fear, the hope, the way love grows stronger when time becomes precious." "Lucas, these are incredible," Emma said, studying the intricate harmonies and thoughtful lyrics. "Have you played any of them?" "A few quietly when I'm alone. But I think they're meant to be shared. Sarah always said that love hoarded becomes selfish, but love shared multiplies." Danny felt a familiar stirring, the same creative excitement he'd experienced as a young musician discovering new possibilities. "I'd be honored to help produce this album. We could record it here at the center, make it a project that involves the kids and families." "Actually," Lucas said with a smile, "I was hoping you'd consider singing some of them with me. Your voice suits these melodies better than mine does now." As the afternoon light slanted through the office windows, the three of them pored over the sheet music, discussing arrangements and recording possibilities. But more than that, they were planning a legacy, a way to ensure that Sarah's story, and all the stories like it, would continue to offer comfort and hope to people facing their own impossible choices. Outside, the sounds of the city continued traffic and construction and the constant hum of millions of people pursuing their dreams and struggling with their realities. But inside the Sarah Sterling Center, in a small office filled with music and photographs, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done, three people who had found their way to each other were creating something that would outlast all of them. Danny looked at Lucas, still amazed by the transformation in his friend's life, and thought about the mysterious ways that cruelty could become kindness, that mistakes could become miracles, that two broken men could find healing by helping others discover the power of music to make even the darkest days bearable. The photo wall that Emma had started in the lobby now contained hundreds of images: children learning instruments, families singing together, volunteers sharing their talents, moments of joy captured in the midst of struggle. Each picture told a story of music's power to heal, to connect, to remind people that they were not alone in their pain. As evening approached, and the center prepared to close for the day, Lucas carefully placed Sarah's compositions back in their portfolio. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of bringing these final songs to life, of sharing the last gifts that love had left behind. But tonight, Danny would drive home to his house that no longer felt empty. Emma would return to her apartment filled with purpose, and Lucas would go back to his small room knowing that Sarah's memory lived on in every note played, every child comforted, every family reminded that music could carry them through whatever darkness they faced. Sometimes, Danny reflected as they locked up the center and said their goodbyes. Redemption comes not from erasing the past, but from transforming it into something beautiful, something useful, something that serves love rather than ego. Sometimes the most important songs are written not by famous musicians, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with grace and courage. And sometimes, the greatest gift one person can give another is the chance to discover who they truly are when all the pretense falls away, when all that remains is the choice to create beauty or contribute to the world's suffering. In the end, that choice, repeated daily, hourly, in moments both large and small, was what separated music from noise, love from selfishness, redemption from regret. It was the choice Danny and Lucas had made together, and it was the song that would continue long after their individual voices had fallen silent.